Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with the author Richard Sakwa. He's got a great book, Deception, Russiagate, and the New Cold War. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are with Professor, I believe, Professor Richard
Yes,
Sakwa, and
emeritus.
that would be Dr. Richard Sakwa, actually, wouldn't
And in German, it would be Professor, her Doctor Professor,
it?
Doctor Professor Sakwa. Yes.
Yes. Well, and he's got a great book. He's written a lot about the new Cold War, Deception, Russiagate, and the new Cold War. What's interesting is I studied Russiagate from the very beginning. From the very beginning, I began to study it. And of course, being a person who has always been extremely doubtful of governmental positions and arguments and things, particularly these types of things, I was skeptical. And the more I looked, the more skeptical I became. And at some point in 2017, I made this the radio talk show. I made the statement. I said, "This appears to me to be an intelligence operation." And that's the conclusion I came to. And the more I saw and the more I thought about it, I thought it was an intelligence operation. But let me ask you this. Your book doesn't just talk about it as an individual, as an intelligence operation or an investigation or anything else. Well, it doesn't simply talk about it. You tie it to the entire new Cold War. Now, I tied a lot of things to the new Cold War. You know, the Skripal affair, the what's the other big one? I really kind of opened with Bill
Litvinenko back
Browder.
in 2006.
Was
Yeah,
that?
the Litvinenko killing.
Yeah, exactly.
Litvinenko.
So talk about where Russiagate falls and in this litany of new Cold War opening salvos, shall we say?
Yeah. No, thanks so much. And first, may I just say that you're absolutely right to be skeptical right from the first. I know that when I visited the United States and talked to people and said, I'm skeptical about this whole story, it just didn't hang together. I actually lost a very good friend, and they said, no, how do you mean? You're not believing all 17 US intelligence agencies, where they're unanimously saying all of this. And of course, you must be a Putinite stooge and all the rest and all the usual abuse. So you're right. As for the idea that it was an intelligence operation, indeed, Stephen F. Cohen, who's written a lot about this, he actually called it, initially was going to have the suffix or prefix to call it Intelgate, precisely Intelgate rather than Russiagate, because of the deep implication of security services in this operation, and not just those in the United States. Above all, it was the FBI under James Comey, it was the CIA, and so the FBI and the CIA, and others were more skeptical, and in fact were slightly more skeptical about it from the start. And of course, it wasn't just the US agencies, the British were involved as well, GCHQ and MI6. And some people even go so far as the whole thing was really driven. It was an Anglo-American operation, just like the Iraq War of 2003. So it was a joint exercise. And of course, at the margins, Australia with Alexander Downer and such like. So that was part of it. But the larger point, you say, that it was deeply involved with intelligence, but at the same time, it was, and why I would rather think that the name Russiagate is better than Intelgate, because it was also a political intelligence operation. And what was most disturbing, and is most disturbing, is the politicization of US and British, indeed, security agencies. And this is as big as, perhaps far worse than Watergate, because Watergate was about criminal offence and stealing, whatever, breaking into the Democratic offices in the Watergate building. But this one, and that was just a group of rather cack-handed individuals whose names I've now forgotten, but we've all watched All the President's Men and so on, at a film with Bernstein and Woodward. But this is so much bigger. It covers far more, and it was a far bigger operation, and it extended to this day. It's Russiagate, and that's why we're talking about it today. It really began, effectively late 2015, but 2016, the run up to the US election that year, in November that year. But now we are, 10 years later, and now we're getting yet more information about it. But it had huge international resonance. Watergate was largely a US domestic issue. This is a global issue. The bottom line is that the Russiagate allegations poisoned and prevented any potential rapprochement between two major nuclear powers, the United States and Russia, and it precluded any ability to move beyond a state of hostility and towards some sort of rapprochement, which could possibly have averted the war we're now involved in, the Russo-Ukrainian war, if things had gone differently, because Trump was accused of colluding with Putin. He had to prove how tough he was, and he had to distance himself from Russia, and he was the one who started supplying severe major offensive arms to Ukraine, which even President Barack Obama did not, for fear of escalation dominance, which Russia obviously has as a next door neighbor. But Trump did that. Of course, now in the light of Trump's second term, we may doubt whether he would ever follow through on any potential rapprochement, but at least it would have been a possibility, which was precluded by the Russiagate hoax. We'll talk about in detail in a minute, but that was, the huge implication of it. It has poisoned, and bottom line, it shifted the world into a second Cold War, a new Cold War, which is far more dangerous, far more pervasive than even the first, and far more, if you like, less controlled. In the first one, after Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, we had guardrails, and there was later on even detente in the early 1970s. This time, it's almost uncontrolled and therefore far more dangerous.
Well, the thing about it is, I think one of the things that's interesting about this, I use the word pervasive. It's so pervasive that the Republicans who pretend to oppose it, right? Even then, when they pretend to oppose Russiagate, they have to redesign it so that they'll say this: well, certainly we know that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election, but the Democrats just used that to attack Trump. They cannot acknowledge the absurdity, oftentimes, of not just that the information that was provided was wrong, but the absurdity of it. So even the Republicans, for the most part, have to pretend, because they're going to go along with the Cold War, that things that have been proven false are true. That things that their own base opposes, they have to kind of finesse this. And one of the examples, I was reading something from one of these Republican reports, and they were talking about, I'm losing track of it. They were talking about a Russian, a claim. I'll remember in a second. I've lost track of it, but you see what I mean. The Republicans, that they'll try to make it a partisan issue, but they have to still pretend as though it's a valid argument that the Russians interfered with the 2016 election using $100,000 worth of Facebook ads, half of which were after the election, and all of these other things. Oh, I know what it was. I was reading this report, and they were talking about the Steele dossier.
The Christopher Steele dossier.
Yes. Yeah. And in this, the Republicans were saying that this was Chuck Grassley's most recent release of evidence, of documents. And he said that even though investigators knew that the Steele dossier may be a Russian influence operation, in other words, as though the Russians somehow wrote the Steele dossier or provided information for the Steele dossier. They're implying that the Steele dossier Perhaps the Russians gave that to Christopher Steele as some kind of an influence. It's preposterous on its face, but they still have to try to find a way. Anyway, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great what you just said, because the Russians are super cunning. That the whole Russiagate thing, you're absolutely right. You know, Christopher Steele's document, which had all sorts of lurid accusations against Trump. For example, at the Miss World conference session in Moscow, that he got up to all sorts of things in his hotel, which was then filmed, and then allegedly the Russian security services had material to blackmail him, compromat, as they call it in Russian. But the Christopher Steele document was such nonsense that it must have been a double bluff, and the Russians, as you say, go for it. But the larger point is even more, that the whole Russiagate thing could have been not that they intervened in the election, but that they pretended to intervene in the election, thus got the Democrats and the Republicans all stirred up and got the United States tied up in knots for 10 years about an issue, which is really what they were trying to do, which was not actually to influence the election, but to undermine American democracy and divide society. That's the ultimate bottom line. In other words, you've got no evidence, no facts, no assertions, so you just make the plot even bigger, which means that you can't actually break down its. You have all sorts of undocumented or ill-founded assertions, which impossible to prove. That did Russia want to undermine American democracy? Well, what's your evidence? Well, we know they wanted to do it, and we know that they didn't like Hillary Clinton. But in actual fact, what is fascinating at this moment is that a number of chickens are coming home to roost. And one of those chickens is the complete malpractice of the leading US newspapers, the legacy media, as we nowadays call them, the New York Times and the Washington Post. In the Wall Street Journal was always skeptical. That's interesting. But the two big ones, who won was a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting in 2018, were phoned for stories which were totally unsubstantiated. It also, this whole thing shows the corruption of American public sphere, because the US intelligence services, which we were talking about a minute ago, were feeding information to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they're doing it to this day. Because what's happening today is that Trump, possibly to divert attention away from the Epstein business, which is another little sub-story going on in the background of this whole Russiagate episode, is that they've now released some more information. And what's come out from Tulsi Gabbard, as director of national intelligence, is quite shocking. And it's not just that, but Tulsi Gabbard is in the lead, and to the point at which we're now finding out a lot more information. We knew that Hillary Clinton was the instigator of it. Well, Jake Sullivan, but Hillary Clinton in July 2016, when basically material was going to come out from the Democratic National Committee, which showed that she was manipulating the election. The committee was in her favor rather than adjudicating and taking Bernie Sanders, who, don't forget, Bernie Sanders in 2016 won, if I'm not mistaken, 22 primaries. This is a Bernie Sanders, alleged socialist, he is, a very brave and courageous man. 122. So she was running scared. Stuff came out about her talking to Wall Street bankers and so on, in which one of her speeches, she basically says, don't listen to what I say while in election, because I'm on your side, basically. Also, a way of covering up. Remember her server, her computer server she was using, and she'd put all her emails, the official emails, on her private server, which of course was a huge case in July 2016. So her team says, let's blame the Russians for everything. And of course, this will go down well in the United States because, as you say, this bipartisan Russophobia. All of this is now coming out. And just, I won't go on too much because there's so much to say, but just one final thing on this. And that is, what's new is how deeply implicated Obama was in all of this. And we now have information, which I mentioned in the book, Deception, Russiagate, and the New Cold War. But it was the meeting on the 9th of December, and the way in which the evidence was bended. They, the head of the CIA and FBI, certainly CIA, said, look, there is no evidence really that there was collusion. And Obama basically said, let's go for it, let's prove it. And of course, that led to the ICA, the Intelligence Community Assessment of January the 6th of 2017, which really basically put a time bomb under Trump's first presidency. So, I mean, this could not be bigger. As I said, Watergate, in comparison, is a molehill compared to this. I was going to say Snowden, but Mount Everest mountain, in comparison to what Russiagate is. It's roiled American public life for 10 years, and it will continue to do so for generations to come. So it's absolutely massive.
One of the things I think that's important to understand about Russiagate is the ubiquitous nature of it in political and intelligence in the political intelligence community. So much so that it must be protected, because if the truth were to come out, the institutions themselves would collapse or be exposed for what they are. I recently saw the emails that were released, the alleged emails that were released. Now, there are people with the Chuck Grassley, Tulsi Gabbard stuff that was released. There are people that say, oh, I don't trust those emails. I do, because they very specifically align with what we already suspected. Our investigations revealed certain things, and the emails that were recently released absolutely align with them. As an example, and this is another example, one of these emails says that the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, was apprising the Clinton administration of what was going on with an FBI investigation, which, if true, which I believe it was, would call for an investigation into Loretta Lynch while she was the Attorney General, and the depths of that, right? Number one, which is, felonious activities. Number two, what the Clinton administration's emails were saying that they were going to utilize CrowdStrike, which was the FBI, and they referred to it as an FBI affiliated company. They were going to utilize CrowdStrike to release information to the media. And they said, we'll get this going, and the FBI will throw oil on the fire. Now, what does this demonstrate? It demonstrates, and they also say we will use other groups, implying intelligence law enforcement groups. What this shows is the Clinton administration was working in alliance with the FBI, with CrowdStrike, with intelligence, and at the same time, the attorney general is involved. This would demand an investigation to show that the entire machine, not just the Democratic Party, but the intelligence agencies and the law enforcement agencies, were all working together for an operation that they knew was pushing falsehoods. This completely collapses any faith that the American people would have in their political institutions, as well it should.
Well, it would collapse it. It would suddenly raise a lot of questions, and therefore we hope it would actually help, save those institutions, because without those institutions, we're all lost, and obviously Americans in the first instance. So, but you're absolutely right. The level of collusion and the cynicism of it is absolutely astonishing. We mentioned the Christopher Steele document. We now know that it was funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign, and that was the one person, Kevin Klansmith, who got punished very mildly for that. But the CrowdStrike business is at the heart of it, because at the heart of the Russiagate allegation, or one side of it, was that that Russians hackers had broken into the Democratic National Committee and then was to undermine Clinton's campaign because they favored Trump over Clinton. Now, there's no evidence for any of this, but the astonishing thing about commissioning in June, July 2016, CrowdStrike, Sean Henry and others, was that they should have applied or used the FBI to do this investigation. Sean Henry, the head of it at the time, admitted that they never actually asked to see the servers of the Democratic National Committee. In other words, you can through digital tracing work out. So they didn't even have the basic professional level.
If I may add one thing to that, I think it's important to understand, and that is there were things that happened that demonstrated that they were lying, and they knew they were lying, and they were covering up. Here's what I mean. So Sean Henry, the head of CrowdStrike, comes out and says, we don't have evidence that anyone stole any emails from the DNC computer, right? Okay. At that point, if I'm involved in that, I say, we've got to, we're out here saying that the DNC was hacked and that the Russians stole it. We now know that there's no evidence that happened. We've got to release that to the people in the interest of transparency, right?
Yeah. Yep.
The Adam Schiff hid it and forbid anyone from saying it. So at that point, that is clear evidence of intent to cover it up, that he was not in any way surprised. Oh, crap. A foundational, a pillar of our argument has come unraveled. What do you want to do? Hide it. Well, now you've clearly shown mens rea, criminal intent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's worse than that, of course, because the material which was published by WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, of course, at the head of WikiLeaks, was astonished that when Mueller, and also Robert Mueller, which also for a whole year bound up, 2 years, the United States in this Mueller investigation, or Mueller, you say in the United States, investigation of Russiagate, he comes up with a document which does not prove any of all of this. It doesn't investigate these issues you've just highlighted, but it does say that Russia intervened in a grand and sweeping manner, which is just an absurd assertion. But one of the downsides, of course, is that then Julian Assange, who actually kept saying, no, it wasn't the Russians. He was given this information on what we call a USB stick, a thumb drive. I don't know what you call it in the US.
Yeah.
It was one of those things. And the Veterans Intelligence for Peace, VIPS people, Ray McGovern and a great bunch of people, they always said this, that technically that this was the only way it could have happened. Julian Assange says yes, and he'd been saying it from the beginning. Yes, I was given this material on this thumb drive, this USB stick. So, but why didn't Mueller investigate him or even interview him? They didn't. Instead of which, of course, meanwhile, poor old Assange has to spend 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy trying to escape. That was a separate issue, but because of the vengeance against another. So this is another scandal. So you've already mentioned 2 or 3. And this is yet another one. So they accumulate these complete travesty of procedure, of basic professionalism. This is a political intelligence, how can I put it, stitch up of grandiose proportions. That's why I say, in comparison to Watergate, this is a mountain compared to a molehill.
Let me give you 3 names. Andrei Telizhenko. Andrei Telizhenko is a former Ukrainian government official. He worked with the Biden administration. He worked with Blue Star Strategies. He said he had a lot. I've interviewed him. He said, I have a lot of information I'd like to present to Congress. So he volunteered to come before Congress and talk about these things and say, this is what I saw and this is the problem and blah, blah, blah. And some members of Congress talked to him and says, okay, before he could speak to Congress, they labeled him a Russian operative and sanctioned him and forbade him from talking to Congress. Natalia Veselnitskaya, who I personally interviewed, the infamous Trump Tower meeting, she was the Russian lawyer who was there. I interviewed her. She explained all what it was about. It had to do with the Russian companies. It had to do with Bill Browder, with the Magnitsky Act. She had documentation, paperwork, right? So she meets with the Trump people, and then of course Russiagate goes crazy. Oh, they met with a Russian lawyer. She says, I would like to volunteer to come before Congress, the United States Congress, and present the information I have to them. So if she was doing wrong, she says, I'd like to give it to the Trump people. They didn't really take it. She says, I'd like to volunteer to come to Congress and give them all the information that I was going to give to the Trump people. When can I come to Congress? They said, we don't want to talk to you. Julian Assange volunteered. I'd like to be interviewed by Mueller. I'd like to be interviewed. So what we have is a pattern of people deeply involved in this saying, I'm volunteering to present the evidence to dispute this. And in every instance, they were attacked, in some instances arrested, they were vilified, and they were denied the opportunity to present evidence.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So the Browder case of Natalia Veselnitskaya, the meeting in Trump Tower, is a fascinating one because and the whole grouping and the way this was completely distorted in the American media and the press reports of it, because she had come about something entirely different. And in fact, you know, she had a whole stack of meetings when she came, and it's fascinating. You should talk with her as well. But the whole Browder Magnitsky case is also, by the way, and we've got to be very careful here because he loves to put injunctions down and so on. But let me just quote one thing, that it was the Magnitsky Act of December 2012 which set off the whole Russophobia business. So Russiagate, in some ways, is a child of Bill Browder's Magnitsky case. And the worst thing about the Magnitsky case is that it's based on a tissue of let's put it delicately, unsubstantiated allegations. Magnitsky was not a lawyer, he was an accountant. Bill Browder, when he testified in Brooklyn over the other things, remember his total silence, his inability to get basic facts right, and so on. So, you know, there's so many different elements to this story, which adds up. I just think my final point on this is that Andrei Nekrasov made a film called The Magnitsky Act, I think it was something like this.
Behind the Scenes, I think it was called, yes.
Yes, and then the subtitle, yeah. And it was only shown once in the United States in Washington, D.C., in the museum. And since then, it's basically Sir Bill Browder he's now been given a knighthood. He has been putting injunctions. It's been shown once in London. I'll tell you, it's a funny story. We were told to meet outside the BBC headquarters, and then at the last minute, they sent us a text where the film would actually be shown. So we were like 19th century conspirators meeting in the dark in December a few years back. And Andrei Nekrasov, the director, was there as well. And then we trooped into a hall, which was booked. And it was a fantastic film, which exposes it. But in other words, the whole Magnitsky case is analogous to the larger Russiagate business. And so we've got cycles, webs of deception weaving in and amongst themselves.
Absolutely. The interesting thing, I've also interviewed Andrei Nekrasov, and what I found out interesting was that he started off doing this Magnitsky Act behind the scenes. He believed Browder. He started off saying, I'm going to do he wasn't a very pro Vladimir Putin. And he said, oh, so he started off doing this thing about the Magnitsky Act to demonstrate, you know, that it was correct and all. And you know, when he started got a ways into it, and he's like, this stuff, I'm confused. These things are contradictory. So he sat down with Bill Browder and he said, hey, you know, we need to talk. I've been doing this, and some of these things are kind of contradicting each other. I'd like to have a talk and ask you a few questions. And Bill Browder attacked him and called him a Putinist, and walked out. And he continued to do the investigation. So here's a guy who thought it was true, trying to prove it. And in trying to prove it, it's proven that it was false. And the whole thing fell apart. But meanwhile, here's the other thing about Magnitsky Act, about Browder. When you dig into it, you find out that he was in Russia in the 1990s. He was buying all kinds of things on behalf of a guy named Edward Safra, who owned the Republican National Bank, which seemed to me to be a CIA Black Ops bank, because they also, here's the interesting about this, his bank, Edward Safra. Bill Browder's financier, shall we say, right? That's the bank that funded all the money for the Iran-Contra affair.
Oh, yeah.
Let me add another one. When the people that broke into the Democratic headquarters there during the Nixon affair there, the
Watergate one.
Watergate. Okay, you can look this up. When they were, caught, they were, everything was searched, and they found that one of them had $6,500 in sequential bills, so they could trace it where it came from. Republican National Bank, Edward Safra.
Oh.
Edward Safra was tied to, from head to toe, he was tied to intelligence. In fact, he had a very strange death,
Yes, he did.
in which his house burned down. It was really crazy. As Robert Maxwell-esque style death, you know what I mean? So my point being, when you start searching Bill Browder's financier, the guy is up to his ears in intelligence. You see what I'm saying? And you see this all throughout these Russiagate affairs, where everything's up to its ears in intelligence connections. You can take them as you please.
Yeah. So the terrible thing is, I mean, you've mentioned, and I agree with all that you've just said, that there are these webs and those allegations and concerns about Edward Safra are there, and the peculiar Maxwell, who suddenly fell off his boat in the middle of the Atlantic, and so on. It's all very bizarre. And of course, I don't want to, bring in and yet another one. Epstein's death is so peculiar, with the camera turned off and no film recorded, and allegations of working with Israeli intelligence and all sorts of things going on there. It really does suggest that the role, the danger is people saying, oh, you're just being conspiracy theorists, you're just going down wormholes, rabbit holes. But the terrible thing is, maybe that the superficial, the sort of the news that's pumped out 24/7 nowadays through the legacy media is just so distorted and so one-sided that it really is frightening. It's very difficult to know how to react to it. I mean, you're doing your blog, your post. I'm trying to do my academic work to try to make sense of it. I suppose that's all we can do, is just to try to pick away and try to get to the truth. I mean, you've spoken to Natalia Veselnitska, who's a decent lawyer. Then she was called, accused of all sorts of things. In other words, just the mere fact of a meeting becomes guilty, rather than the substance of what we're trying to find beneath it, to say, actually, guys, what is going on? And what is going on, as you suggested, is the subversion of our institutions. That's the intelligence services, the media itself, and everything else. And unfortunately, and that's why I tie this all to the geopolitical situation, what this has done is poisoned atmosphere between Russia and the United States, which has huge consequences, because we are in the foothills of the Third World War at the moment. So, more that we can talk about it and expose it is that we can hopefully avert the world hurtling towards Armageddon.
Absolutely. And this what people seem not to grasp, here's the other, here's what, I guess another way of putting it. What's unique about the Cold War, this second iteration of the Cold War, or maybe 2.0, or continuation of it, is the move to hide what's going on. The work of the media to hide how dangerous this situation is, to keep people just wandering around, thinking that, okay, this is just your daily life, continue while there's nuclear posturing. And to continue what they're doing. Yes, Vladimir Putin saying this or doing this, or aimed at the Chinese. Oh, China's doing something in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. This posturing towards nuclear powers, as though a military confrontation between nuclear powers is just another, benign, just another, it's something that needs to happen. We've got to put these people in their place, not ignoring the potential for an extinction level event. That's what I find so horrifying and absurd.
Yeah. And one of the worst things of all of this is that so much of this began in December in late 2016, when Obama attacked the infrastructure of diplomacy. So that instead of maintaining channels, remember the expulsion of 35 Russian diplomats in the last days of December 2016, and something that had never happened in the first Cold War, he closed down the Russian holiday home, it was, I think, in Maryland, and one other installation. And of course, he then established this investigation, which, of course, the FBI had opened Operation Crossfire Hurricane on the 31st of July 2016. So, in other words, he added a whole new dynamic to it, which was attacking deliberately, as you say, your nuclear power, in Russia, and setting, and of course, this the fact that the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislitsyn had been speaking to Mike Flynn, and Mike Flynn didn't last more than just over a month, and he had to be sacked as the National Security Advisor, I think he was nominated. So it just escalates the whole thing to the point at which now, towards the war in which, the Russo-Ukrainian war, which is very much potential to go much bigger going on. In other words, we have two things going on: the death of diplomacy and dialogue. And the second thing is that anybody who's critical of it is then accused of disinformation, and you've got this whole network now of people who work this counter disinformation industry. So, which goes to the height of absurdity. Even when, say, a Russian or somebody else, a critic, says something critical like us, they would say, "Oh, one, you'd be tarred to say, look, you're a Putin's useful idiot," and all of this sort of talk, which is crazy, really disgusting. But also, the anti-disinformation industry is a way of closing down those independent outlets. And as we know, the way that there's been a lot of pressure on Amazon and so on to not to delist, but to make sure that when people search for websites, that those are more critical ones come up very low down in the search, in the algorithms. So algorithmic warfare against independent voices who are challenging the distortions in the public sphere. So it's really very difficult to know how to go beyond it. And as you say, both the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States share so much in all of this. Today, obviously, one of the reasons a lot of this is coming out is because this is the revenge of the Republican establishment against the Democrats, but with their own distortions while they're doing it, of course.
One of the other interesting things here is a really extreme contradiction. I've read polls that I think Germany, 59% of Germans say, no, we would not take up arms to fight. We kind of hate our government. Britain, I heard up to 70 or 80%, but the numbers are very high. The people are suffering. They're unhappy with their leaders. I think Keir Starmer is probably less popular than head lice. Okay. But here's what's interesting. The Starmers and Merzes and Macrons are saying, we're preparing for Russia, a war with Russia in 2027 or 2029. We've got to get geared up. We've got to get ready to fight Russia. Their military is pretty much non-existent. Their money is non-existent. Their people hate their guts and don't want to go to war and fight for them against anybody. Now, the leader of the country said, we must prepare for war, a massive war with a nuclear superpower. The nuclear superpower says, we don't want a war with you. We'd rather talk and have some, come up with a new security agreement. So we're preparing war with this nuclear superpower that said specifically, we don't want a war with you. Meanwhile, our economies are crashing. We got to prepare for war. We don't have any money. We don't have a military industrial complex that could create the war material if we wanted to. The people don't want war. And we have to literally take extra democratic means to stay in office and to stop people from winning in our bloc who would oppose this war. And last but not least, it is quite clear that if we actually got the war we want within hours, we'd be all dead of a nuclear, which we call it. So what my dad used to have a thing about, sometimes even when you win, you lose. Every single thing says we can't afford the war. We can't build the things that we need for a war. The people say that say we will not fight the war for you. And if somehow we were able to start the war, everyone else would be dead within hours of a nuclear holocaust. The absurdity of this makes you shake your head.
Yes, you're absolutely right. As for the unpopularity of the British government, it's absolutely Keir Starmer is one of the most unpopular leaders at this stage of his government in history, and more than that, because he absolutely lacks a vision. And we don't expect a massive utopian vision. We're just talking about a basic, sensible sense of where you're going. He came to power proclaiming that he would continue Corbynism without Corbyn, that is a more left-wing, progressive peace agenda, as you say, instead of which then very quickly he repudiated that. I just say what's interesting is that in the UK, you've probably heard that there's that the Jeremy Corbyn and a few other MPs are thinking of establishing a new left political party, which I think is a fascinating exercise. It isn't a party yet, but over 500,000 people have signed up to receive news about this new adventure. It's called at the moment Your Party, but that's obviously they're going to have a discussion about what they're going to call it. So in other words, actually, if it's more than 500,000, it's closer to 600,000 people. It's unbelievable, the hunger for a genuine alternative political organization which can have at its heart and at its core a peace project rather than the war project you've just talked about. Because it is, our elites are whipping up a war fever which is similar to that seen in 1914, which and of course that ended very badly for all of us. So, and indeed, you have Merz in Germany and Macron in France, who are trying to establish this so-called coalition of the willing. Now, have they no shame? The coalition of the willing in 2002, 2003 launched an illegal, catastrophic invasion of Iraq, and yet these shameless people are using the same term for another misadventure. You couldn't make it up.
Well, how about this? The coalition of the willing apparently doesn't include the people in their country, because the polls clearly say the people are not willing. What's interesting now, during this Cold War, it's far different than 1914 for this reason. You didn't have Telegram and X and things like this. So the people in 1914 didn't have the details of what was going on behind the scenes with their government. The people now kind of know. A lot of the people know. They have access to information. And so unlike in the people didn't want war in 1914, but they were kind of easily dragged into it. When the government said, we're going to war, the people put on their uniforms and off they went to war to be mowed down in the trenches or die of some horribly easily curable disease, preventable disease. But my point being, if in fact the British government, the French government, dare I say the US government said, here's what we're doing. We are now going to have a draft and we're going to get everybody ready and we're going to march you up to the Russian border so that we can have a war with Russia. They'd burn the place down. They'd start building, you know what I mean? In the United States, they'd burn this. Young people, look at the polls under 30. The people that would be ready, the people that are struggling the worst, the people that are hurt the worst by this economy that only helps the rich. If you say to those people, hey, guess what? You know that government that you despise with the heat of 1,000 suns that have threw you under the bus 30 years ago before you were even born? Yeah, they want you to go to the Russian border and fight and die in a war. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near Washington, D.C. because it would be in flames. And I suspect it would be the same in Berlin and Paris and London.
Absolutely. Yeah. The way that obviously sometimes public opinion of the sort you mentioned is dismissed. Oh, these people, they are just consumers. All they're interested in is their iPads and watching, whatever they're doing, Xboxes and such like. That is exactly the sort of Clintonite basket of deplorable statement, is that people are so stupid. All they want to concern is their private lives. No, I actually think that the attitude which you've just alluded to is that they're actually, in a sense, more responsible as citizens than the elites like to admit. that these people say, no, this is just irrelevant. And, even they have a clear awareness that on the other side, there are, 144 million Russians with exactly the same aspirations as those in the United States or United Kingdom or anywhere else to have a normal life, but also to be, proper normal citizens and live in your own civilizational sphere and so on. So what ultimately is this war about? In the in this first Cold War, we knew communism versus capitalism. We knew that, and the geopolitical contestation over Central European space, whether Poland and Hungary and so on. That was relatively clear. Then, of course, who would dominate Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and all the rest, all those proxy wars in Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, etc. What on earth is it about this time? What is that fundamental division? Joe Biden, of course, was, in his typical cack-handed manner, he said it was democracy versus autocracy. Well, that is perhaps one of the most, how can I put it, greatest simplifications and obfuscations of our time. There's a whole different spectrum of so-called autocracies, and it doesn't prevent the United States and so-called democracies getting on with quite a lot of them. That is, just mentioned Saudi Arabia, which so far this year has executed 230 people, many of them for being, homosexual or whatever.
All of the Gulf monarchies,
None of them are
that we
particularly
support,
tolerant. Yes,
that couldn't stay in power unless the United States kept them in power. Most of them, they'd had their heads cut off. The leaders would have their head, you know what I mean? The US and Britain keep them in power. I'd say this. If you look at the Epstein case and other things, a lot of Americans and what's going on, Americans, the MAGA people are starting to say, I didn't vote for this.
Yeah.
We didn't want to attack Iran. We didn't want, you told us the Epstein, more and more the concept of democracy. Le Pen, whatever you think about it, she had a right to run. Now she's in jail. We don't know about the case, but they're looking at what's happened in Romania, Moldova, one of the politicians sentenced to 7 years. And people are looking at saying, you told us it was democracy versus autocracy. But in our various countries, we're seeing politician after politician go to jail that would run for office. And to be quite frank, you have to look at Russiagate and you have to say the initial intent, albeit Donald Trump turned out to be, in this particular iteration, problematic for the whole Russia scheme, which, again, we get back to Russiagate pushing things that direction. But you have to look at that and say, that was the same operation, that they looked at him and they said, well, this guy's running. He's not the person we want. We want Hillary Clinton. Let's try to tar him, put him in jail, lock him up, throw him out. The whole thing was, all of these operations clearly show the ruling elite, the intelligence operations, the political leaders and operatives do not view this as a democracy. They view the illusion of democracy should remain until such time as the people say, well, perhaps we want someone. Look at even Bernie Sanders, what happened internally with that and the whole WikiLeaks thing, that we want to maintain the illusion of democracy as long as you pick the person we want. As soon as you decide to go in another direction, well, that illusion has to evaporate.
Yeah, I'll have two things to that. At the bottom of Russiagate, what was it about? And it's exactly that. What the word I nowadays use, or the concept I use to describe that, is how Western market or capitalist democracy, liberal democracy, has become democratism. By democratism, I mean that you have the form, you have elections, parliaments, you have political parties contesting as if, really fighting for genuine alternative political programs. But ultimately, standing above it is this vision that democracy has to be subordinated to a certain external goals. Nowadays, geopolitical confrontation with Russia, and when that's finished, go on to China and so on. And second, that we must make sure that we don't undermine this neoliberal consensus of outsourcing in which workers are, the dignity of labor is undermined, and any autonomous expression of the dignity of labor and of fair practices and so on, and indeed of a genuine how can I put it, environmental market system. We can't allow all of that. So it's democratism. It happened in Russiagate with the 2016 election. They did it again in 2020, of course, when the Hunter Biden laptop story was suppressed by 51 security officials. This was, I think it was the New York Post. Divine, I've forgotten her first name, broke the story, and it showed just how deeply Hunter Biden was involved in all sorts of bad things, including in Ukraine, Burisma, and so on. Then again in 2024. And of course, you mentioned Romania, you mentioned Marine Le Pen in France, and everywhere else. So democratism is where you have the form of democracy, but the substance of making, the ability to make real change is limited by geopolitics and geoeconomics. And that's not allowed. That's my first point, democratism. The second one is that you mentioned, the MAGA people are being a bit alienated from the Donald. Well, absolutely. The way I looked at it and the way I'll start this and the way I have been looking at it, but I have to modify it, is to say that Trump represented a threefold defecting. He was seceding. The first one, which is why a lot of people were open and sympathetic to him, from the Atlantic alliance system, NATO, and all of that geopolitical, and of course, commitment to the defense of Europe. And of course, 80 years later, after NATO was established in 1949, nearly 80 years later, they quite rightly in the United States says, why are we paying 70% of NATO's costs to defend countries which are in some ways far wealthier than we are, when we have all those difficulties in Ohio and et cetera, et cetera. So that defection from the Atlantic, NATO, and so on, and in other words, for peace, he kept saying this mad war in Ukraine, ultimately the most avoidable, pointless war imaginable. So that was the first defection. And that's where a lot of the MAGA people, had a certain sense. The second defection was a defection not just from the Atlantic system, but and this is even more concerning, was from the international system established in 1945. By that I mean is the United Nations Charter and all of the subsequent protocols, which do not belong to the United States, do not belong to Russia or China. This is a genuinely universal vision at the end of the most catastrophic war in human history in 1945. And of course, as we're sitting here, today is the anniversary. Today is the anniversary of the bombing, atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And 4 days later, the 9th of August, on Nagasaki. After that, humanity, for a brief moment, had a vision of an alternative world, and that is expressed in the United Nations. And Trump is trashing it. He's defecting from it. As you know, leaving the World Health Organization, no longer funding so many good things. Closing even USAID. USAID had the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think the good was about 40, 50, 60%. This is helping women in Ethiopia and so on, doing great work. And a lot of dedicated Americans and others worked for that agency. The bad, of course, was its political interference. And the ugly was funding these NGOs to do such like. So it's complicated. But that was a second defection of Trump, which I think is very bad. I reject it because I think the Charter, international system, UN system is the third defection is from the US Constitution domestically. Now, you've got a lot to say about that. I won't talk about it, but you all, and you've mentioned some of the things earlier. That is why the Trumpian presidency, some people had a sense that it could offer that, he talked about peace, but ultimately he has repudiated every single substantive positive element in his MAGA agenda. America should be first. America should look after its national interests. That's common sense, but it should do it in partnership and others. He has not given up on globalism. He's given up on liberal globalism, but what we now have is mercantile or openly coercive imperial globalism, and that's nothing better than what we had before. Biden was a catastrophe and the others, but this is probably even worse. I don't know.
I would argue it's worse. I would argue it's better for this reason. I'd rather, my dad, again, just an old country guy, but he had an old saying, you know what? I prefer a rattlesnake over a copperhead or a cottonmouth, because the rattlesnake rattles first and you can walk around it. The cottonmouth, you step on it and it bites you, right? The openness of what's happening under the Trump administration went out, because I prefer not to say Trump so much as this is the Trump administration. And to me, in a way, it is the most clear vision of what America is. We're going to overthrow your country, but we're going to say we're doing a nice job. We're going to say we're going to help you, but we're going to overthrow your government, and we're going to assassinate people. We're going to do things. You know what? Just put it right now in front of my face. Trump puts it right there so people can see it, know what it is, understand it, and then act against it. I can see a positive nature to that. But at any rate, I got to get ready to run now, and I certainly appreciate it, Richard. I think if it's possible, I'm going to be traveling for a little bit for about a week or so, but I'd love to get you back in. I think this is a great conversation. I'd like to continue talking about it. Where can people find you online, or can they find you online?
I don't have a social media presence because it was hacked and attacked by so much for so long. So, I mean, just my books. That's it. Amazon, could find it all listed there. Go for it.
All right. Thank you very much. And I'll be in touch with you in about a week or so, and hopefully we can get back and continue this conversation.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Richard Sakwa. Thank you very much, everyone. And follow me on Telegram and Rockfin and Rumble and all that stuff. Patreon, if you can afford to, whether PayPal or buy me a coffee, it'd be great if you can, help keep the channel going. If not, the most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you. We're out.